Wyoming Territory, June 1879. The wind carried the smell of pine and gunpowder as the sun dipped low behind the Gros Ventre Range. A thin line of smoke still curled up from the edge of the burned-out cabin, and just beyond it, a woman stood with a rifle in both hands, her dress torn at the hem and blood on her knuckles. "Do not take another step," she said, her voice low and steady. The cowboy froze. He had seen a lot of things riding across the West, but never a woman standing guard over two small children while a barn smoldered behind her. "I am not here to hurt you," he said, lifting his hands. "Name is Lawson Zeke." I saw the smoke from the ridge. The children behind her, one boy, one girl, both no older than 7, clung to her skirt. Their wide eyes peeked out from behind her, scared but quiet. The woman said nothing for a long moment. Then she lowered the rifle, but only partway. "Juliana Prescott," she said. "This is George and Grace." Lawson nodded. "You all right?" She shook her head once, sharp and short. "They came last night, took the horses, set fire to the barn. They tried to get in the house." "Bandits," Juliana's voice cracked. "3 of them. They thought no one would be out here. They did not expect me to shoot first." Lawson looked over her shoulder at the cabin. The door hung off its hinges. There was a dark trail of blood in the dirt. "You kill them." "1, the rest ran." Lawson stepped closer slowly. "You are safe now." "Let me help." Juliana looked down at the children. Grace held one of her fingers. George had dirt on his cheek and a scrape across his chin. "They are not mine," she said softly. Lawson frowned. "You are not their mother." "No, their parents died crossing the Snake River last winter. I was just the one who stayed behind to keep them alive." Her eyes flicked up. "I do not know what happens now." Lawson looked at the small homestead half-burned, the corral empty, nothing but ash and broken boards. Then he looked at her. Her face was pale, but her hands were still steady. Her dress was torn, but her boots were laced tight. She had gone through hell, but she was still standing. "You pack a bag," he said. "I will take you and the children to my ranch. It is a day's ride south. We will figure the rest from there." She hesitated. "I do not take charity," she said. "This is not charity," he replied. "This is a man returning a debt to the land. My father died in a fire. If someone had come for us, maybe things would have been different." Juliana looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "All right." They rode out before nightfall. Lawson put the children up on his horse and walked beside them, reins in hand. Juliana rode behind on a mare she had hidden in the trees. She kept her rifle in her lap the entire way. They stopped before midnight, making camp near the river. Lawson set the fire, careful with the dry wood. Juliana sat with the children, wrapping them in a blanket while they leaned against her shoulders. When the stars came out, she finally spoke again. "They scream at night," she said. "Both of them. I just hold them until it passes." Lawson glanced over. "You are doing right by them." "I do not know what I am doing." "Well, you are keeping them alive. That counts for something." She looked at him across the fire. Her face was softer now, the shadows hiding the bruises at her temple. "Why are you helping us?" He stirred the fire with a stick. "Because no one helped me when I needed it. And because sometimes God puts people in your path for a reason." Juliana looked down at the flames. "They had names. The men who died, the ones I shot." Lawson nodded. "That does not make you a killer. That makes you a survivor." They sat in silence for a while. The fire cracked low and steady. Grace curled into Juliana's side. George was already asleep. Lawson leaned back against his saddlebag, watching the stars. "I have not seen stars like this in a long time," Juliana said. "That is because you have been too busy surviving," Lawson replied. She looked at him. "And what about you?" "I have been too busy being alone." That night she did not sleep much, neither did he. But when the fire burned low and the children were quiet, she leaned back against the tree beside him. Not touching, just near, it was enough. By the next evening, they reached Lawson's ranch, a stretch of land tucked between 2 hills, with a proper house, a barn, and a fence that needed mending. Juliana helped him lift the children down. They stared wide-eyed at the house. "This is yours?" she asked. "My father built it." "I have kept it going." He showed her the guest room, made sure the children had a place to sleep. She tucked them in, whispered something in their ears, then closed the door. Lawson stood in the hallway, hands in his pockets. "I will sleep on the porch," he said. "You do not have to, I know." "But I want to," she nodded. Thank you. The next morning she was up before the sun. She found him already outside splitting wood. She took the axe from him without a word and started helping. You do not have to do that, he said. I know, but I want to. He smiled and handed her another log. They worked in silence, side by side. A week passed. Then too, Juliana helped with the cooking, then the sewing, then the books in his study. She fixed the hinges on the barn door, taught Grace how to stitch a button, showed George how to read the labels on the seed sacks. Lawson watched her. The way she moved with purpose, even when she was tired. The way she smiled at the children, even when her eyes looked heavy. One night as they sat on the porch, she looked at him suddenly. Do you love me? She asked. Lawson turned toward her. The sky behind them was red from the fading sun. The wind had quieted. Every day you keep breathing beside me, he said. Juliana blinked, then looked down. Her hands were folded in her lap. He reached over and placed his hand on hers. I mean it, she nodded. I know. She turned her hand in his, laced their fingers together. They sat like that until the stars came out. And this time, neither of them was alone. By the third week, the ground had softened from spring rains, and the first shoots of barley pushed through the soil behind the main barn. Juliana knelt beside the rows with her skirt tucked under her knees, pressing dirt around the stems with calloused fingers. A strand of hair had slipped loose from her braid, brushing her jaw as she worked. George sat nearby, sorting pebbles into a tin pail, while Grace chased a grasshopper through the tall grass, careful not to step on the seedlings. Lawson leaned against the fence post a few yards away, one boot resting on the lower rail. He watched without speaking, the brim of his hat drawn low against the sun. His shirt clung damp to his back. He'd been hauling water from the creek since dawn, but his gaze stayed steady on the woman crouched in the dirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sleeves stained with soil and sweat. Barley's coming in strong, he said finally, not raising his voice. Juliana didn't look up. So long as the wind doesn't turn on us. He crossed the space between them and crouched beside her, resting his forearm on his knee. You always talk like the land's waiting to take something back. She dusted her palms on her skirt, because it is. Lawson didn't argue. He looked down at the rows she'd tended, neat and evenly spaced, then at her hands, raw along the knuckles from working without gloves. You sleep at all last night? He asked, her mouth pulled tight. George woke up with a fever. He's cooler now. I boiled some willow bark. Next time, wake me. I didn't want to trouble you. He reached over and gently turned her hand so he could see the blisters starting to rise along her palm. You think you're alone in this? I don't think that, she said quietly. I just don't know how not to be. Lawson stood and offered her his hand. She hesitated before taking it, letting him pull her to her feet. Her fingers lingered in his for a second longer than necessary. Let's get you water, he said. And something for those hands. Inside the house, Juliana sat at the table while Lawson unwrapped a small bundle of cloth from the kitchen shelf. He poured a little boiled lard into a dish and mixed in dried comfrey leaves, pressing them into a thick salve with the back of a spoon. I haven't seen that made since I was a girl, she said. My aunt used to keep a crock of it by the stove. Lawson dipped a clean strip of linen into the mixture, then reached for her hand. She raise you, she tried. Juliana didn't flinch as he pressed the cloth to her palm. She was all that was left after the fever, but she didn't last long after that. He wrapped the linen carefully, tying it snug but not tight. How old were you? 13. He set the bowl aside and looked up at her. You carry it all quiet. Like it's something you owe the world. She met his eyes. Don't we all owe something? He didn't answer right away. The silence between them was gentle, like the hush of wind through cottonwood. Then he reached up and brushed her hair back behind her ear. You don't owe me anything, Juliana. Her breath caught just a little. That's not how I was raised. He let his hand fall. Maybe it's time for something new. That evening, while Grace and George sat on the porch playing with a pair of smooth stones they'd found near the creek, Juliana stood at the kitchen window drying a plate. Lawson was outside, feeding the chickens, his shirt sleeves rolled and the last of the sunlight catching in his hair. She watched him for a long time, then turned and folded the dish towel. Her hands were still sore, but the ache felt honest, earned, not endured. Later, as the sky darkened and the children drifted to sleep curled together in the loft, Juliana stepped out into the night. Lawson sat at the edge of the porch, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. She stood beside him, arms folded across her chest. "You never said why you stayed," she said. He looked up at her. "Here? No, that night, when you saw the smoke." Lawson set the blade down and leaned back on his hands. "I was headed to Jackson to trade for seed, saw the fire and figured it was nothing good. I almost kept riding, but you didn't." He looked at her, steady and quiet. "I'd seen too many women buried with their stories untold. I wasn't about to let it happen again." Juliana sat down beside him. "Sometimes I try to remember what it felt like to laugh." He didn't try to comfort her. Just nodded once and said, "I haven't heard you yet." She looked at him sharply, then down at her hands. "I'm not ready. I can wait," he said. She turned toward him. "Why?" Lawson didn't hesitate. "Because every time I look at you, I see a life that didn't quit. That counts more to me than anything." She stared at him for a long time, the moonlight soft against her face. Then she asked, "Do you love me?" Lawson's voice was low, sure. "Every day you keep breathing beside me." She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She just reached out and took his hand in both of hers, resting it against her chest. They sat that way until the stars wheeled overhead and the night cooled around them. No promises spoken. None needed. A hard wind came down out of the hills in late July, bending the cottonwoods along the creek until their leaves flashed pale and silver. Juliana stood in the doorway of the smokehouse, her apron streaked with salt and brine, watching the trees sway. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of cured pork and applewood. She wiped her hands on the hem of her apron and stepped out into the yard. Lawson was at the paddock, coaxing a skittish chestnut gelding into the halter. The horse pawed once, then let him slip the rope over its head. He murmured something low as he tightened the knot, then led the animal toward the trough. "New?" Juliana asked, walking up beside him. "Traded for him yesterday. Fella from over near Star Valley said he was mean, but I think he's just bored." She studied the gelding's eyes. "He's young, 3 maybe." Lawson glanced sideways. "Wiry and fast. Thought George might take to him when he's older." Juliana nodded, then looked past the fence toward the low ridge where the sun was beginning to dip. Grace asked if she could have a dress like mine. "One with sleeves that roll." He chuckled, a quiet sound. "You'll have her in boots next. She already stole mine yesterday, said she was trapping rabbits." He tied off the lead and dusted his hands. "She catch any? Not even close." They walked back toward the house side by side. The porch boards creaked under their weight, the wind tugging at Juliana's braid. Once inside, she pulled the kettle from the stove and poured water into the basin. Lawson took a seat at the table, rolling his sleeves back down. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The quiet." "Before we came." He didn't answer right away. "I miss what I thought I needed." She set the kettle back on its hook and turned around, wiping her hands on a cloth. "And now I hear laughter in the loft and see someone in my kitchen who knows what to do with pickling salt." He met her gaze. "That's better." Juliana leaned against the counter, arms folded. "I sent a letter to a cousin in Missouri, told her I'm not coming back east." Lawson sat straighter. "You had plans." I had guilt. Thought maybe I'd left too much undone, but there's nothing there for me now. Just names I used to answer to." He stood and crossed to her, the space between them slow to close. "And here, I don't know what to call this yet. But I know it feels like something I didn't think I'd get again." He reached for her hand. His thumb brushing over the band of skin her gloves had long since worn down. "You don't have to name it yet." Juliana looked up at him, her voice quiet. "You said you'd wait." "I did." "Have you wondered if I ever would?" "Not once." She stepped closer, close enough for the warmth of her breath to reach him. "Do you still mean it, what you said that night?" He didn't hesitate. "Every day you keep breathing beside me." She rested her forehead against his chest, her fingers curled into the front of his shirt. "Then I'm not going anywhere." He held her there, nothing urgent in his touch, just the steady surety of someone who'd waited long enough to understand the value of stillness. Outside, the wind quieted. The trees stilled. Somewhere near the barn, a dove called low and long. When Juliana looked up again, there was no uncertainty in her eyes. "We've built something here," she said. "Not just shelter, not just safety." Lawson nodded. "We're not surviving anymore." They didn't kiss, not then. But she reached up and laid her hand against his jaw. and he leaned into her palm like he'd been waiting for that, exactly that, and nothing more, since the moment he saw her standing guard in front of a burning home. That night, as the lantern burned low and the children dreamed overhead, Juliana lay beside Lawson in the room they'd both come to call their own. Her hand found his beneath the quilt, fingers laced with his. She whispered, "I never thought I'd feel peace again." His voice came soft, steady. "It was always waiting for you." She turned toward him in the dark, and for the first time in years she let the quiet settle without fear. The wind had passed, the fire had long since cooled, and the home they'd made was not one of necessity but of choice, of want, of love, hard-earned and wholly theirs. The air turned sharper in August, the kind of dry breath that spoke of coming frost even as the sun still beat hot at midday. The cotton sacks hung heavy on the fence line, full of wild rosehips and dried sage Juliana had gathered with grace along the ridge. Lawson was mending the wheel rim on the wagon, the youngest Prescott sitting cross-legged nearby, carving notches into a stick with the small knife he'd earned by finishing his reader. Inside the house, the light slanted long and golden across the floorboards. Juliana stood at the cupboard, sorting through a bundle of letters she'd found tucked in the back corner of a drawer old correspondence, kept by the man who had once called this house his own. Her thumb brushed the seal on one, unopened and brittle along the fold. "I didn't know he wrote to anyone," she said as Lawson stepped through the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "He didn't much. That one came from Arkansas, a cousin, I think. My father never opened it." She handed it to him. "Why not?" He turned it over slowly in his fingers. "He didn't believe in looking back. Said a man who spends too long in yesterday forgets how to tend tomorrow." Juliana folded her arms. "I used to think the past was something to outrun, but it doesn't fade, it just waits." Lawson set the letter on the mantel, unopened still. "Some things are better left waiting." They didn't speak for a moment. A meadowlark called from the edge of the pasture. Outside, the wind caught a loose shutter and knocked it once against the window frame. Juliana turned toward him. "George asked me this morning if he had to take your last name to stay here." Lawson met her eyes. "What did you tell him?" "That names don't make a family, but if he ever wants to change it, it'll be his choice." He nodded. "He's got your back in him. Steady no matter what comes." She leaned against the table, fingers trailing the worn edge. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse in town. It's empty, boarded since last spring." Lawson tilted his head. "You want to teach again?" "I think I'd like to try, just mornings." "Grace is asking more questions than I can answer, and George, he's ready for more than I can give him here. You'd be good at it." "I was once," she said. "Before everything." He stepped closer. "You still are." She looked up at him, her voice quieter now. "Would you mind?" "Me riding in most days?" "I'd ride beside you." She smiled, not wide, but enough. "And if I came back with other children trailing behind me?" "Dusty and loud and hungry. I'll build a bigger table." That night, after the chores were finished and the lanterns had been blown out, Juliana sat beside Lawson by the hearth, her feet tucked beneath her. The room smelled faintly of cedar and lye soap. She held a folded piece of muslin in her lap, needle threaded but untouched. "I never told you about the last man who asked to marry me," she said. Lawson didn't look away from the fire. "You don't owe me that. I want you to know, he was a merchant's son. Promised me a piano and a dress with pearl buttons. I said yes because I didn't know what else to do." "What happened?" "He caught influenza before the banns were posted. I sat with him until he couldn't speak anymore. He died with my name on his lips, though I don't think he ever really knew me." Lawson turned toward her now. "And did you love him?" "I wanted to. I tried, but I didn't feel it, not like this." He reached for her hand, warm and calloused against his. "Do you love me?" she asked, not uncertain, but needing it said aloud in the hush between them. Lawson didn't pause. "Every day you keep breathing beside me." Her eyes closed, just for a breath, and when they opened, the weight she'd carried behind them seemed lighter. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just for the children, not just because it's safe here." "Then stay for you," he said. "Stay for us." She leaned in then, and this time their lips met soft, certain, with the kind of ease that comes from knowing the other's silences. It wasn't the rushing kind of kiss that burns hot and fades. It was the kind that said, "I see you, I have seen you, and I want to keep seeing you." Later, they lay in bed, windows open to the night, the hush of crickets threading through the dark. Juliana rested her hand over Lawson's heartbeat, steady beneath her palm. "You're not what I expected," she said. He turned his head. "What you expect? Someone who'd give me a place to rest, not someone who'd teach me how to stay." He kissed her forehead. "You taught yourself that." "No. You let me." And with the wind settling outside and the children asleep above them, Juliana closed her eyes, not from exhaustion but from peace. The kind that arrives not with grand gestures, but with the quiet certainty of knowing you've found where you belong. By September, the mornings came in cool and blue, with frost crusting the fence rails and the scent of wood smoke drifting low through the valley. The barley fields stood golden and tall, ready for cutting, and the hills had begun their slow turn toward ochre and rust. The house had taken on a new rhythm, quiet, steady, full. Juliana stood by the barn with her sleeves rolled and her skirt pinned up at the sides, tying bundles of dried corn stalks for the animals. Grace and George were down by the creek with a basket between them, searching for late raspberries. Lawson was in the loft, mending the last of the broken shingles before the winter set in hard. She heard his boots before she saw him, the slow tread of someone not in a hurry, which told her the roof was done. He stopped beside her, wiping his hands on a square of canvas. "You'll want to check the chimney before frost sets in," she said, not looking up. "Already did. Found a bird's nest, cleared it and patched the crown." Juliana paused, then offered him a length of twine. "You're moving through the list faster than I can make it." Lawson took it and began tying the next bundle. "That's because I know what's coming. The first snow's never kind to those who don't prepare." She raised her brow. "Is that how you see me?" "Unprepared," he glanced at her, then back to his hands. "I used to, just didn't know it then." Juliana tied off the last stalk and brushed her palms on her skirt. "I spoke to Reverend Hargrove yesterday. He asked if I'd consider organizing a winter gathering at the schoolhouse, something to bring folks in from the homesteads. You say yes." I said I'd think on it. "I've never been one for hosting. You've never had a place of your own to invite folks to." She looked at him then, the way the wind tugged at the corner of his collar, the creases near his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. "I have one now," she said. Back at the house, she poured warm cider into tin cups while Lawson lit the fire. George and Grace returned with stained fingers and pink cheeks, their basket half full. They settled near the hearth, whispering between sips. Juliana leaned against the doorway, her hands wrapped around her cup. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked, her voice low enough not to carry. Lawson didn't look away from the fire. "I've thought about what I'd want it to feel like." "What's that?" "Like walking through the door and knowing the light's on because someone waited for you. Like being seen and not having to ask for it." Juliana stepped closer. "And if you already had that, I'd ask for the rest." She set her cup down on the mantel and took his hand slowly, like she meant to remember every part of the moment. "Then ask." He turned toward her and held her gaze. "Would you stay with me under my name in this house, not because you have to, but because you want to?" "I already chose you," she said. This would just make it known. They were married the following Sunday, under the cottonwoods behind the house, with the last of the yellow leaves clinging to the branches. Grace carried a handful of late asters, and George stood beside Lawson with his boots shined and his shirt tucked neat. Juliana wore her everyday dress with a new ribbon at the collar. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled when he placed the ring in her palm, an old brass band his mother had worn, polished until it gleamed. Afterward, they served cornbread and stewed apples on the porch. The neighbors who came brought jars of preserves, a quilt, and a basket of sewing needles. When the sun sank low, Juliana sat beside Lawson on the porch rail, her feet bare, her head resting against his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd ever be someone's again," she said. "You're not someone's," Lawson answered. "You're mine, and I'm yours." She watched the children chase fireflies in the yard. "They're safe now. They're home." That night, with the windows shut against the chill and the fire low in the hearth, Juliana lay curled against Lawson with her hand resting over his. There was no urgency to their closeness, only the quiet bond of people who had walked through fire and stayed standing. In the months that followed, the schoolhouse filled again. Juliana taught 4 children from neighboring ranches each morning, her voice sure, her chalk steady. Lawson built her a small desk, and Grace insisted on sharpening the slate pencils. George rode the chestnut gelding up the ridge each afternoon, always back before dusk. By winter's end, the house had grown fuller not in size, but in spirit. There were no more questions of leaving, no more debt owed to the past. Just the rhythm of wood chopped, bread baked, lessons taught, and hands held. Years later, when the cottonwoods had grown thick and the children taller than the window sills, Juliana stood in the same doorway where she'd once held a rifle and watched the world fall apart. Now she watched Lawson hitch the wagon for market, Grace tying her bonnet just so, and George helping load the crates. She stepped out into the light, the wind lifting her skirts, and walked toward the life they'd built, every step sure, every breath steady, every morning a promise kept.